In this episode, we start by shifting your mindset from reacting to privacy problems to spotting the early warning signs that make those problems likely, because beginners often think threats and vulnerabilities only belong to cybersecurity teams. In privacy engineering, threats and vulnerabilities are broader, and they include technical weaknesses, process gaps, vendor weaknesses, and human behaviors that create a path to privacy harm. The CDPSE exam expects you to recognize that privacy failures usually do not appear out of nowhere. They emerge when a vulnerability exists and a threat takes advantage of it, whether that threat is a malicious attacker, a careless employee, a rushed project timeline, or a confusing workflow. The earlier you identify these conditions, the more options you have to reduce risk through design, controls, and training, instead of trying to clean up damage after the fact. This is why Domain 2 treats threats and vulnerabilities as part of repeatable risk management rather than as isolated technical events. You will learn how to define privacy threats and vulnerabilities clearly, how to look for them across systems and operations, and how to connect them to practical risk reduction steps. By the end, you should be able to listen to a scenario and identify what the likely threat is, what the underlying vulnerability is, and what controls would reduce the chance of operational failure. A solid foundation is understanding the difference between a threat and a vulnerability, because the exam often tests your ability to separate the two even when they appear together in a single story. A threat is a source of potential harm, such as an external attacker seeking data, an insider misusing access, a vendor failing to secure a system, or even a business process that pressures teams to cut corners. A vulnerability is a weakness that makes harm more likely, such as overly broad access, missing logging, unclear data classification, weak vendor oversight, excessive retention, or lack of training. In privacy terms, a threat becomes meaningful when it can exploit a vulnerability and affect personal information, such as by exposing it, altering it, using it for an inappropriate purpose, or making it unavailable when rights must be honored. Beginners sometimes treat threats as scary names, but the exam is more focused on the mechanism, what could happen, and why it is possible. Another common misunderstanding is assuming vulnerabilities are only software bugs, when privacy vulnerabilities often include process design failures like unclear request handling procedures or inconsistent consent enforcement. When you can clearly separate threat from vulnerability, you can propose the right risk response, because you can either reduce the vulnerability, reduce exposure to the threat, or both. This separation is also what keeps your analysis consistent across different types of scenarios. Privacy threats can be grouped into a few practical categories that help you identify them quickly without turning the topic into an endless list. One category is external malicious threats, such as attackers seeking to steal personal information through hacking, credential theft, or exploitation of misconfigured systems. Another category is internal misuse threats, where employees or contractors access personal information without a legitimate need, either out of curiosity or for personal gain. A third category is accidental threats, such as human error, misdirected communications, or incorrect system changes, which can cause exposure even with good intentions. A fourth category is vendor and supply chain threats, where third parties mishandle data, experience breaches, or introduce insecure processing. A fifth category is design and purpose drift threats, where data is used beyond its original purpose without proper transparency or choice, creating privacy harm and compliance risk. The exam expects you to recognize these categories because privacy incidents often reflect one of them, and preventive controls differ depending on which category is in play. Beginners often focus too heavily on external attackers because that is the most dramatic threat, but privacy failures are frequently caused by misconfiguration, process confusion, or uncontrolled internal access. When you learn to name the category, you reduce cognitive load because you can focus on the most likely failure mechanisms rather than guessing. This becomes especially helpful when questions present multiple plausible concerns and you must choose the most important one. Vulnerabilities in privacy programs often start with visibility failures, meaning the organization does not know what personal information it has, where it flows, or who can access it. If data inventories are incomplete or outdated, teams cannot assess risk accurately, cannot answer rights requests completely, and cannot respond to incidents with confidence. If data classification is inconsistent, staff may treat sensitive information casually or may over-restrict low-risk data, both of which create operational problems. If data flows are undocumented, personal information can quietly spread into analytics platforms, logs, and vendor systems, increasing exposure and making retention and deletion harder. The exam often tests these visibility vulnerabilities by presenting scenarios where a team cannot locate all instances of data or does not know whether a vendor holds it, and the correct answer usually involves improving inventories and mapping as a foundational control. Beginners sometimes treat inventories as administrative work, but in privacy engineering they are control enablers that make everything else possible. Visibility also includes understanding purposes, because without purpose labels and documentation, data can be reused improperly and no one can prove whether use is appropriate. When visibility is weak, threats become more dangerous because the organization cannot see or control the pathways to harm. Strong privacy programs treat visibility as a core safeguard, not a nice-to-have. Access control weaknesses are another major vulnerability area, and privacy engineering treats access control not only as protection against attackers, but also as protection against inappropriate internal access. Excessive privileges, shared accounts, weak separation of duties, and lack of periodic access reviews create opportunities for misuse and increase the chance of accidental exposure. The exam may test this by describing a system where many employees can view sensitive personal information even though only a small subset needs access, and the best answer often involves least privilege, role-based access control, and monitoring for unusual access patterns. Another access vulnerability is lack of context-based restrictions, such as allowing support staff to access full records without justification or without a record of why access occurred. Logging is tied closely to access vulnerabilities because without logs, the organization cannot detect misuse or prove what happened during an incident. Beginners sometimes assume privacy is satisfied if data is encrypted, but if many people can decrypt and view the data without oversight, the privacy risk remains high. Access vulnerabilities also appear in data sharing, such as granting broad access to a dataset for analytics without masking or minimization. When you evaluate access vulnerabilities, you should consider not only who has access, but also how access is granted, how it is justified, how it is monitored, and how it is removed when roles change. These details are what determine whether access control is a real control or just a concept. Process and workflow vulnerabilities are often the hidden drivers of privacy incidents because they create confusion and inconsistent behavior, especially in time-sensitive situations. If there is no clear workflow for rights requests, staff may mishandle requests, miss deadlines, or disclose data to the wrong person. If incident reporting channels are unclear, employees may wait, attempt to fix issues quietly, or fail to preserve evidence, which turns a small issue into a larger operational failure. If consent and preference management is inconsistent, some systems may respect choices while others ignore them, leading to unauthorized processing. If change management does not include privacy triggers, teams may deploy new features that collect or share data in new ways without assessment or documentation updates. The exam often tests these vulnerabilities by describing repeated errors or inconsistent responses and asking what foundational improvement should be made. A mature answer often involves defining and embedding workflows, training staff, assigning ownership, and maintaining documentation as part of operational practice. Beginners sometimes look for a technical fix when the real vulnerability is a process gap that allows mistakes to repeat. Process vulnerabilities are also amplified by organizational change, because new staff and reorganizations expose whether the program relies on informal knowledge. When you can identify workflow weaknesses, you can recommend controls that make behavior consistent, which is exactly the exam's goal for risk management maturity. Data lifecycle vulnerabilities are another important category, because privacy harm often grows over time when data is collected broadly, retained indefinitely, and replicated across systems. Excessive collection is a vulnerability because more data increases the attack surface and increases the likelihood that data will be misused or exposed. Over-retention is a vulnerability because even if a dataset is safe today, it can become a liability later through incidents, policy changes, or evolving threats. Uncontrolled replication into backups, logs, and derived datasets is a vulnerability because it makes deletion and rights fulfillment difficult and creates hidden stores of personal information. The exam may test this by describing a system that deletes user records in the main database but retains data in analytics stores or backups without controls, and the mature response involves implementing retention schedules, limiting replication, and creating defensible approaches to backup handling. Another lifecycle vulnerability is purpose drift, where data is reused for new analytics or personalization without revisiting transparency and choice, turning a once-appropriate collection into an inappropriate use. Beginners often assume that once data is collected, it is available for any future use, but privacy engineering requires purpose limitation and reevaluation before reuse. Lifecycle vulnerabilities are often less visible than access vulnerabilities, but they create long-term risk that accumulates silently. When you learn to look for lifecycle drift, you will see many privacy problems before they become incidents. Vendor and supply chain vulnerabilities are especially important because they expand the environment beyond your organization's direct control, and they often show up as operational failures during incidents and rights requests. A major vulnerability is weak vendor due diligence, where organizations onboard vendors without confirming capabilities, processing locations, and safeguards. Another vulnerability is weak contract terms that fail to restrict processing purposes, fail to control subprocessors, or fail to require cooperation for incidents and rights requests. Another vulnerability is lack of ongoing monitoring, which allows vendor changes, region expansions, or new subprocessors to introduce new risk without review. The exam may test this by presenting a vendor breach and asking what should have been in place, where mature answers include strong contracts, defined notification timelines, and evidence requirements. Vendor vulnerabilities also include data minimization failures, such as sending more data to a vendor than needed, which increases exposure and complicates obligations. Another common vulnerability is unclear responsibility boundaries, where the organization assumes the vendor will handle certain obligations like deletion or request fulfillment, but the vendor lacks the workflow or authority to act. When vendor vulnerabilities are addressed proactively, the organization maintains control through the supply chain rather than discovering weaknesses during a crisis. The exam rewards this proactive posture because it reflects real privacy engineering maturity. Threat modeling is a structured way to identify threats and vulnerabilities before they become operational failures, and you do not need deep technical detail to understand the high-level method the exam expects. The goal is to examine a processing activity, map the data flow, identify who could misuse or attack the data, and identify where weaknesses exist in access, logging, retention, and workflow controls. In privacy contexts, threat modeling also considers misuse of data for inappropriate purposes, not only theft, because harm can occur through profiling, unfair decisions, or opaque processing. A practical approach is to look at each stage of the data lifecycle, from collection to sharing to retention, and ask what could go wrong and what control would prevent or detect it. This method helps avoid the beginner mistake of only thinking about the most obvious threat, because structured thinking reveals less dramatic but more likely failures, such as misconfiguration or uncontrolled internal access. The exam may test whether you can select a proactive step, like conducting a privacy assessment that includes threat and vulnerability identification rather than waiting for an incident. Threat modeling also connects to evidence, because you need logs and documentation to detect and prove what happened if a threat becomes real. When threat modeling is used consistently, it improves both design quality and operational readiness, which supports repeatable risk management. A key part of identifying threats and vulnerabilities is learning to recognize signals that a system or process is drifting toward failure. Signals include increasing data collection without clear purpose updates, expanding sharing relationships without documentation changes, growing numbers of people with access without access reviews, and recurring minor incidents that suggest a pattern. Other signals include long delays in responding to rights requests, inconsistent handling of consent across systems, and gaps in logging that prevent confident investigation. Vendor signals include frequent service changes, unclear subprocessor disclosures, or slow response to security questions, which may indicate weak internal controls. The exam expects you to connect these signals to the idea of program monitoring, because monitoring is how organizations detect drift before it becomes a major incident. Beginners sometimes ignore small issues because they seem manageable, but repeated small issues often indicate a systemic vulnerability that needs remediation. Recognizing signals early allows an organization to apply corrective actions, such as tightening procedures, improving training, or reducing data retention, before harm escalates. This is the proactive mindset the domain title points to, because privacy engineering is most effective when it prevents operational failures rather than just documenting them afterward. When you can articulate early warning signs and the controls that address them, you demonstrate the kind of reasoning the exam tests. As we close, identifying privacy threats and vulnerabilities before they become operational failures means building a disciplined habit of looking for the conditions that make privacy harm likely, not just the events that happen after harm occurs. Threats include external attackers, internal misuse, accidental errors, vendor failures, and purpose drift, while vulnerabilities include visibility gaps, weak access control, unclear workflows, poor data lifecycle discipline, and weak vendor oversight. A mature program recognizes that privacy vulnerabilities are often process and governance weaknesses, not only software bugs, and it uses structured methods like privacy-focused assessments and threat modeling to reveal risks early. Visibility through inventories and data flow mapping reduces uncertainty. Access controls and logging reduce misuse and improve detection. Workflow clarity reduces error under pressure, and retention and minimization reduce exposure over time. Vendor controls prevent loss of control across the supply chain, and monitoring for early warning signals helps organizations address drift before it becomes a crisis. The CDPSE exam rewards this proactive capability because privacy engineering success depends on anticipating how harm could occur and strengthening controls before failures become public incidents. When you can consistently name the threat, identify the vulnerability, and propose a defensible control response, you are demonstrating the repeatable risk management reasoning that Domain 2 is designed to measure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.